Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the invite. I think of myself as an aspiring digital humanist, and it's really wonderful to put my work in front of people who are sort of in many cases actual digital humanists. So thank you so much for having me today. So by way of an introduction, I'm going to be showing some work that is very much ongoing. The sort of the outputs are sort of in process, and so there's room for discussion about both where the work is headed, how I'd actually just love to hear some feedback, and I will say also that it's work um, that's been very much a joint effort, both in terms of my immediate sort of working group. I need to thank Zulek Ayub, who's a PhD candidate in architecture at Princeton, and Chris Alton, who teaches urban design at Ryerson University in Canada, for the work they've done on this as well. Beyond that, I think at this point in Zoom world, I'm so desperately sick of hearing myself speak that I'm going to give the task to anyone but me for just a moment and let Rachel Small of the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network ground us a little bit.
We're here outside the world's largest mining convention. Toronto has shown out by the hundreds to say no to the business as usual of this industry. We will not allow their ongoing colonization, land theft, violence, environmental destruction to continue. PDAC itself estimates about 25,000 attendees are joining them this year from at least 130 countries. At least 30% of the attendees, they say, come from outside Canada, so this is truly a global conference. Toronto is the global capital of mining finance, and Canada in general is the global hub of mining. Over 2/3 of mining companies around the world are based here in Canada, so we're right here in the belly of the beast.
Their business as usual is a world where the rights of capital always take precedence over human rights.
We're here to disrupt as much as we can because there are Indigenous communities all over the world impacted by these companies. All of these corporations are connected to the larger infrastructure of resource extraction.
Extractive companies think they can hide in this convention center and literally give each other awards for corporate social responsibility, for sustainability. They are holding glitzy galas all this weekend and this week to literally celebrate each other's greenwashing and charitable efforts.
Okay, so I think probably the position of the piece becomes fairly clear at the get-go. That video was taken by Beyond Extraction Toronto at an event convened by, among others, the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network outside of the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada annual meeting, March, I think, 1st of last year. So this was my last trip before lockdown. I think actually someone was later found to have had COVID at the conference and all that stuff. So but the point here being that this is an enormous convention, an enormous meeting, and is a really central place where the mining industry comes to showcase new technologies, comes to sort of coordinate exchange and sell property and share recent developments in both industry and on the land. And along with a number of colleagues, both with the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, my own group, Graphy, and a group of scholar-activists from York University called Beyond Extraction, we put together a counter conference alongside the PDAC conference that had a number of components, some of which we'll be touching on today. But I think that the place that we're trying to take the work sits somewhere between these two statements that came out of the content that came through in that video. First of all, Vanessa Gray, an Amjinung land defender, says that these corporations are connected to the larger infrastructure of resource extraction, and Rachel Small of the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network suggests that extraction companies hide in this convention center. And so I think that the work that we're trying to do is both focus on the way that extraction works as an industry, and focus not just on the sort of not just focus on the mines, but focus on the sort of larger infrastructure of mining as an industry and activity, while also I think so. There's sort of a planetary economic aspiration, economic analytical aspiration, but we're also trying to be really granular in a lot of ways and focus in a kind of didactic way almost on the convention center as a site, as a really kind of bounded site of exchange. And so, oh God. And so I think just to preface this, it would be a little absurd to present a project on things that are we start identifying as colonial on slide 1 without a land acknowledgement. And so I do just want to say that this is not true actually. I'm not joining today from what settlers call Somerville. I'm joining today from what settlers call Briarcliff Manor, New York, on the traditional unceded territory. Oh no, I didn't update this. I don't actually know. This is so bad. I will follow up. But the work that I will be presenting today was largely carried out on the expropriated land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I do just want to say I always feel a little strange giving these things because they've become very rote, specifically so rote that I didn't bother to update my slide. And I think that the thing that I like to return to is this argument by Eve Tuck that this is necessary. These are necessary moves, but that the sort of trajectory of a decolonial project has to be the project of land back. So the acknowledgement and the project. So just to sort of point out, just to give credit where credit is due again, this is a collaborative work that was supported by a generous grant from the Antipode Foundation, which is a group that funds sort of critical activist work, and supported a group of us to put on a counter conference that included both that major rally outside of the conference was partially funded by this grant, but also some counter conference activities, including citizen science workshops and lectures that we participated in. And so I think first, just to place us in the conversation of some of the theory we're working through. I don't want this to become a theory talk, but I think it is important because we're drawing our sort of methodological approach from some recent work in urban theory, specifically the work of Martin Arboleda, who's written a book called The Planetary Mine, Territories of Extraction Under Late Capitalism. And Arboleda's point is really that there's been an emphasis on two things. One, the mine, and two, the sort of nation states that benefit from certain regimes of extraction that are balanced in certain ways. You can think of traditional world systems theory and that kind of thing. And his point is to say, well, look, like, yes, the nation is salient. The mine is obviously a site of, in many cases, extraordinary environmental destruction. But we can also what we can do more, maybe more analytic. There's more analytical usefulness maybe in focusing on the way that actually extraction is not just it doesn't just happen at the mine. It happens through a range of economic incentives, through sort of a huge system of infrastructures that have enabled and embodied a kind of technological lock-in. There's a range of sort of both technical and social changes that have created mining not just as an act that happens in a place on a site in a mine, but in the kind of very infrastructures of the cities we live in and the cities we build. And so that's the ground that we're standing on as far as thinking through the relationship between, in our case, convention center booths, right? The most boring thing in the world, a convention center booth with a person in a polo and two shiny pamphlets, taking that very seriously as a site for really kind of planetary circuitry. And so I'm going to break this into 3 sections. First, I want to talk about some workshops we led at the conference itself. These are, I think of them as citizen science workshops, but they're also critical corporate research. So there's a long tradition of critical organizational research that looks into how firm structure and subsidiaries and ownership and these kinds of things. And what we were trying to do in the context of these was take participants through an exercise by which they'd learn how to both do that work, how to look at corporate filings, figure out who owns what and where, and that kind of thing, but also produce sort of rapid fire pamphlets and maps that we could use in the context of sort of direct action, so things to hand out at a rally. Next, I want to talk a little bit about how we approach this cartographically. Right, I'm ultimately a mapper. I'm ultimately a sort of cartographer person who thinks primarily cartographically. And I think there are 2 things we're trying to do that are a little interesting. The first is that we're trying to challenge a number of conventions of urban cartography that I'll get into a little bit, and play with forms of cartography that are a little more rich in terms of their ability to depict depth and the subsurface and tallness and volume and all these kinds of things. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the convention center portion of the project and how that relates to the sort of larger scale analysis that we're building into an application that an interactive that we'll be releasing sometime, hopefully fairly soon. So let's get off of this very dull slide. We put together these workshops on one of the days of the counter conference, and the notion was that we could. I teach GIS specifically, and we were trying to figure out, like, okay, what's the bare minimum you can work through in an 8-hour workshop to sort of get folks to do interesting research and also produce things by the end in a way that's sort of streamlined and folks actually get some kind of knowledge out of it. And so our approach ended up being to both, we did a little bit of introduction we did a little bit of introductory work on sort of activist uses of mappings and these kinds of things. I also just throw this slide in to tip my hat to my colleagues Zuleika and Chris, who were a big part of this project. But our focus really was these 2 portals, namely the System for Electronic Document Analysis and Retrieval, or CDAR, and the System for Electronic Disclosure by Insiders, or SETI. These are 2 portals that have been set up by the Canadian state, and are basically they are public portals that provide access to industry filings. So if I'm Barrick Gold, for example, I can look at these filings and find out, okay, what subsidiary companies do I own? What subsidiary companies do those subsidiary companies own? And it's actually kind of they provide a bunch of documentation that actually is really kind of incredibly detailed as far as the kind of ornate corporate structure of large global mining firms is concerned. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. And I think part of the reason that you need a research workshop to do this is because these things are, I mean, this is, you don't want to get into pure speculation, but I don't think it's surprising that portals that provide access to industry data for an industry that's a huge part of the Canadian tax base are in fact quite opaque and difficult to interact with. And so we walked participants through essentially how to get annual filings by individual companies. This is the organizational chart for Barrick Gold, which is, I think, the largest gold producer in the world. And the amazing thing about it, I realize this is very small and I can't really zoom in, But if you trace down, if you go down through these subsidiary relationships, ultimately, and this is the fascinating thing, you get to the mine. So you can trace down, and eventually, in this organizational chart, you do wind up sort of in a very literal way touching ground. And so our process was essentially to guide participants through how to navigate these subsidiary relationships, producing, photos. The thing that we did actually in advance was to we developed a sort of attachment to the PDAC website, and we're kind of meticulously scraping it every couple days to gather in advance a list of participants, so we knew who was going to be there. Right? We're trying to focus this on specifically companies that are exhibiting. And this is a range of companies, right? I think from my perspective, as someone who teaches GIS, the one that catches my eye is this one. The Environmental Systems Resource Institute, or ESRI, which produces ArcGIS, the sort of industry standard GIS platform. And it's, I think the relationship between GIS and mining is a fascinating one, because it's essential to the operation. And one of the things that's actually kind of driven actually a reopening of a lot of previously closed mines is the fact that prospectors and developers can now get a much clearer picture of subsurface deposits using cragging and geostatistical methods, which means that you a lot of mines that were previously unviable are suddenly viable again. So there's been some reopenings and this kind of thing. Anyway, so ESRI's role in this kind of thing is a fascinating thing for me that I'm hoping to dig into more sometime. But the basic, I think I'm going to try to balance a little bit of like, here's what we did, here's how we thought about it, here's the stuff we used. We gave folks a crash course in QGIS, actually the free and open source alternative to ESRI that actually my department has started teaching a lot of our GIS coursework in. And taught folks to use OpenCage, which is it's a geocoder. So here's an address. How do you turn that into a coordinate? It's a hard problem, and it turns out that there are a number of sort of off-the-shelf solutions that make it pretty easy. OpenCage being an especially good one because they don't store your data. They're one of the only geocoders that make that promise. They don't store anything. So that was the approach, and we ended up producing these sort of cute handouts. And I think they're very pithy. they're not complex, but I think in the context of in the context of their purpose, right? These are flyers for a rally. Right? We're not looking for analytical subtlety, and so we really just got folks to produce quick GIS maps based on the results of their research into firm subsidiaries, and went from there. So I think that we were trying to balance kind of, skill sharing, and also sort of, I guess activist tactical questions, which is sort of an interesting thing to sit between. Okay, so that's the sort of stuff that we did at the conference. I think what we've been doing recently is following up on that and trying to think about how we represent this material in a way that is visually compelling, analytically interesting, and actually actually reveals things through the act of representing, rather than just kind of illustrating what we already know. And I think the first thing we tackled is that as a collection of architects and designers and mappers with architecture backgrounds, essentially mappers with urban design and architecture backgrounds, we came up against the fact that we were mapping in, we were focusing on a convention center in downtown Toronto. Downtown Toronto is a vertical volumetric place. Yeah, this is a photo from the rally, and I mean, you know, these are large buildings, right? And I think there's also a lot of subsurface activity. I mean, this is just an underpass, but in the convention center itself, for example, we were dealing with a space that was eight stories below ground. And so we got really interested in both, like, okay, how do you think about a cartography that's better at sort of depicting urban environments? How do you think about the sort of urbanistic challenge of like a very actually kind of urban representational challenge of how do you sort of build cartographic tools that are in a lot of ways more architectural, and also how do you start thinking about subsurficial stuff that happens underground. And the second thing is especially interesting from a sort of conceptual perspective, in the sense that, you know, as I was saying a moment ago, the role of mapping in the mining industry is specifically to map the subsurface. That's the sort of function of cartography. And so there's sort of a you know, kind of a useful critical reversal there, where you take a kind of you take an approach that's intended to that's often deployed to map the subsurface of developed and developable lands, and instead deploy it to map the kind of subsurface of industrial activity. So there's kind of that thing that appeals to me. The basic problem here is that maps suck at volume. Maps, especially as we build them now, are really kind of very sterile when it comes to volumetric representation. I mean, I think about like Mapbox, which is a well-known sort of contemporary web mapping and interactive platform, and you know, it's great. Like I build stuff with Mapbox all the time, but it's you know, a building is not an extruded footprint. You know, we can look at, for example, the CN Tower here, which is just, you know, right from the building footprint up. And I think, you know, there's sort of a interesting challenge here. And how do you do this in a way that's not just taking a building footprint and turning it into a little tooth on the ground? And so in this way, we were aided by the fact that the city of Toronto actually makes a fully articulated massing model available on their planning and development office's website. So you know, in that way, thank you, Toronto. So you know, we actually didn't need to do much of this modeling ourselves, which is amazing, because we in the time we had could not have done all of this modeling ourselves. What this lets us do, right, is start from a position of having a sort of a much more fully articulated sense of urbanism that we're starting from, instead of the sort of much more static kind of much more reductive cartography that we'd be sitting with if we were using Mapbox or something like that. And I think also it let us be very kind of playfully literal about the sort of conference center. I mean, we in a lot of ways, this all we were doing is taking a prompt very literally, which is, okay, how do we show both an urban environment and a exhibition hall that's 8 stories below ground? And you know, so we did a bunch of architectural rendering stuff. I'm happy to talk about architectural rendering if you'd like, but I'll sort of skip over that stuff. And just say that also, I mean, this is maybe, again, we're in a lot of ways, we're doing this just in a way that's very literal, right? We need, if we're going to be talking about a convention center space, if we're going to be talking about an exhibit floor, we need floor plans. So really, much of the initial work was tracking down floor plates, tracking down plans of floor plates, tracking down documents describing the space, so that we could kind of model it in a way that's not creative at all, and not just very exceedingly literal. And let me tell you also, like there's nothing actually fun about modeling a convention center. This is convention centers are the most boring architectural prompt there is. And so, you know, this is, again, from an architectural perspective, very rote, but I think from a cartographic or a digital humanistic perspective, a little more interesting, in the sense that we're sort of taking seriously the way that space works to structure certain activities. So we meticulously georeferenced all these things. Ultimately, even you're even able to get fairly sectional, in the sense that we found a write-up of the convention center from Canadian Architect in September 1997. So, you know, how deep is it? How high are the floor plates? That kind of stuff. So fun, if a little bit, again, literal. You know, so I won't belabor the fact that we drew some walls and drew some convention center booths, but I think really the point is we're trying to work between multiple scales, which means that we can't really work with either simply sort of conventional cartographic boundaries, conventional cartographic representation. We need to be sort of multi-superficial. And finally, I think this was my favorite part of the exercise. Lest anyone ever say that disability is not a superpower, my friend Zuleika, who was at that point in a wheelchair, became our Steadicam, and we strapped GoPros on a wheelchair and sort of combed through the conference center and sort of capturing. We're not actually interested in the people ultimately here. Like, that's the point here, is actually very much not the people. It's the visual rhetoric. It's the maps on the wall. It's the sort of feeling of the space. And so, you know, we're ultimately, you know, absolutely prioritizing anonymization and all that stuff. But what we're trying to do here is really kind of point to a very specific kind of experience, sort of phenomenological thing that happens in the space, right? We're trying to, in a lot of ways, open the convention center to inquiry and analysis in a way that we understand it to kind of foreclose otherwise. So there's a sort of I'm sort of attached to this part, in the sense that I think it does give you a sense of the way that this stuff operates in a really kind of lived ground floor way. So at the end of the day, ultimately we're building a tool. We're building some kind of visualization, and I'm happy to talk stack at any time, but I do just throw it up here in case there are any interested folks in the room. I can just kind of let it sit here for a moment. And then I think also, you know, the thing we're interested in too as a collective is how do we work between architectural, urbanistic, and geographic modes of representation, because there's quite a lot of disjuncture between the conventions of these representational techniques, and there's different tool sets and all that kind of stuff, and each can do different things differently. So where are we at as far as the tool itself is concerned? Well, we're building something that looks a little bit like this. I apologize, I've gotten very into brazen pinks. So that's a me thing recently, and I apologize. But the idea here is that we're dealing with sort of a triptych. We're dealing with, on the one hand, this sort of ground level view of the convention center from a sort of eye level thing, while simultaneously taking these spaces very seriously and also depicting them cartographically on the right. So we're working in kind of 3 scalar registers, and this is at this moment, this is very simplistic, but what we're doing is sort of tying an exhibitor to not only the booths at the convention center, but also the countries where they have active exploration activities. So it's not refined in the sense that we're not pointing to specific mines, we're not pointing to specific activities. right now we're just highlighting national relationships, which is not necessarily where we want to go eventually. But at the moment, we're sort of limiting ourselves to this sort of national representation, which, you know, in some senses, at the sort of scale of the planet, still useful, in the sense that national relationships do continue to structure the way this industry behaves, and to some extent, and it's still a salient unit of analysis. There's not. Yeah, we're not trying to abandon the nation state as a unit of analysis entirely, but I think our sort of subsequent activities are going to be focused more on locating specific, not only specific mines. I think you know, and this is just gesturing to something that I'm not throwing in front of you, but we're working on a tool that does the opposite of what I think you'd expect a sort of expose the mining industry kind of tool to do, in the sense that what we're sort of, we don't want to focus on the mines, because I think unless you're doing sort of environmental analysis and sort of really kind of grounded activist work, I don't find it all that compelling to just put together a bunch of representations of mining pits and trailing ponds. So instead, what we're going to be, what the next step is going to be, is putting together a sort of archive, compendium, whatever you want to call it, of mining headquarters. I think there's one of the things that I've been really interested in recently is there's an anthropologist named Laura Nader who became really well known in the 1970s for an article that she wrote called "Study Up the Anthropologist: Perspectives Gained from Studying Up," which Chelsea Barabbas at MIT, who's I believe in the Media Lab, has done some really interesting work with as well recently. But the notion is that we tend to focus in kind of, you know, activistic or critical scholarship on you know, the effects of disinvestment, the effects of racialization, the effects of, you know, the effects of things. And I think the thing that Laura Nader proposes, and that we're trying to take very seriously, is what do you get when, instead of doing that, you focus on the people who are in many cases responsible for bringing those things about? What happens when you map the extractive industry, not the sites of extraction? When you map the, you know, there's sort of a what's the sort of critical moment that you're permitted into when you're that you're able to access when you focus on the entities and forces that are responsible for bringing about the things that we're working to change. Anyway, so this is where the interactive stands right now. This is not yet online because our anonymization is not yet perfect. So we haven't posted it yet, but hopefully that will change soon. Yeah, at this point we can just kind of, I'll click a few things, and we actually noticed that a lot of them are focused in Canada. So that's where the tool is right now, and we're seeing it as part of a larger project that's about both the convention center, the industry, yes, of course, the mine, and also and the relationship of all these things and how it's mediated by, in some cases, mapping technologies. I think the last thing that I'll say, and I've been saying this in various talks recently because I think it's interesting. We put in a book proposal about 6 months ago around this work, with, I'm not going to name publishers, editors, anything like that, but we got the publishers, the editors were very interested. The reviewers of the proposal were also very interested. It was in line with, you know, I sound like I'm being salty about the rejection, which I'm really not. It happens all the time. But what I am being salty about is this: the fact that in the letter and the sort of rejection note, the reason that they gave was, we're concerned that the mining industry will sue us, so we can't publish this, or we don't want to, or the publisher will not publish this. basically the editors went to the publisher and asked, look, will you, the mining industry is famously litigious. If they try to slap suit, what are the commitments you can make to ponying up some kind of legal fees? The publisher said, no go, we don't do that kind of thing. And the project was dead in the water, at least in this form at that moment, which I think is reflective of a certain set of problems that are, I think you can kind of forget about in academic work sometimes. I think sometimes it feels very removed, and then you kind of try to publish, some work about an industry, and because that industry is known to sue folks, it becomes impossible to publish. And so I think, yeah, there's just, I end with that to say that, to both, like, I guess, identify where the project currently sits in a kind of purely logistical way, but also to identify some serious barriers that face folks that are trying to do this work, and to get it out there. So I think actually, yeah, that's about all I wanted to say, and I'm right at about the amount of time that we said we would take. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen after saying thank you to everyone. Yeah, we can go from there. Cool. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Wow. Okay. Do people, so let me not necessarily take the first question. Are there questions from some? Yes. Oh, sorry, Patricia, I thought you were raising your hand. Are there questions that people in the audience have?
I have a, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just enjoying being outside right now. It's really beautiful.
Oh, that sounds so lovely.
Boston, yes, it is lovely. Well, thank you so much for this talk. I'm a fellow geographer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't work with GIS or cartography, but I am in the anthropology department here at MIT, and I do work on the extractive industry as well. So it was really exciting to learn about your work, and thank you so much for your presentation. So I just kind of wanted to put a plug just as a fellow geographer here. But I guess one of the questions, I mean, I have a couple of questions. One is just a really thing I'm just interested in is that you're working as part of this collective, and just something I'm always curious about, that is how you are navigating publishing together, and especially with these challenges of publishing about the extractive industry. So that's the one side. The other side is I am really curious, the way that you're approaching planetary extractivism, I think is so fascinating, so important. And something though that I kept thinking about when thinking in terms of volume, and you revealing that so well. I mean, I do work in Mongolia, and then when you show like Centerra Gold and some of these other companies that are operating in Mongolia, to me, I'm thinking, wow, like that stuff in the ground, that land in the ground has made that architecture. It's helped. I mean, Mongolia's still new on the scene, but it's like what's giving that volume to the financialization of urban space in places like Toronto. And so I guess that's where I'm thinking about like how I get why, like, not wanting to connect to the mines. I respect that move, but I also think, I mean, and like bringing up this notion of land back, like the land is there, the land is rooted in the urban space. So just like how, I'm curious about how you're navigating that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the questions. First of all, so I as far as the publishing is concerned, that's a fairly easy question. I can't take credit for driving that project. My colleague Chris has been really pushing on that, and I think I'm part of I'm part of a group of scholars that's based out of York University called Beyond Extraction, and they've been working for much longer than I've been involved to cultivate relationships with a wide range of primarily young anti-extractivist scholars. And so the volume that we proposed was driven primarily by first of all, yeah, not driven by me. I feel like I have to say that. It's driven by Chris Alton and Devin Holterman. Thank you. But I think that the way that they've been, yeah, the way that they've been trying to focus the work is I think it's sort of an interesting model. For a couple of years, they were doing sort of standard academic colloquia kind of stuff. You know, like every year we do a colloquia. I think recently, last year, it was their first big move into like, okay, we're going to work with activist organizations. We're going to try to organize things that are a little more directly disruptive. And so I think they have had a lot of time to build as a collective some kind of shared agenda around both sort of a shared set of academic references, but also in planning this event, there was a shared kind of agenda that came out of long conversations with MISN, the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, and with other groups that are far more on the ground than we are. And I think that the other thing I'll say is that it's a proposal. We did not walk in with a manuscript, so we actually haven't successfully managed the book to completion. The other thing that, as far as the inextricability of the urban fabric from the mines, I fully take that point. I think, I guess, let me refine the. I'll start by refining the point I was making, and then I'll reflect a little more on the question. I think what I was, again, we're working as primarily, I think we're primarily folks who work visually, and I think we came up against this thing where we bought a bunch of data. We bought a bunch of mining industry data, so we have locations for most of the active mines in the world, and most of the retired ones. And I started doing this thing one Sunday where I just started, I said, okay, I'm going to automate a process. I'm just going to like make an enormous grid of all of the mines in the world. And I was looking at this, I was like, oh my God, like this is just pure aestheticization. This is nonsense. And so in responding to that person, I was just like, oh my God, I can't do this. This is garbage. I'm just like making land art out of out of trailing ponds. And so I think from the perspective of someone who works visually, there's always the risk of turning a critical position into a coffee table book. I think I was just thinking like, okay, what do we do instead that's not so focused on? And so I think I guess my point is that I'm not trying to diminish the analytical usefulness of the mines or of even the inextricability of the mines with exactly what we're talking about, but I'm instead responding to a much narrower problem with visual work, that is, how do you depict without in some way tacitly kind of pornifying. And I think that's the initial response. I mean, I think, yeah, in terms of the more robust point you were making, which is about the fact that cities are in fact built on and by on and by the extractive industries. I mean, that's yeah. I don't. I think that's actually a really useful point, because if we're going to, by focusing on sorry, actually that was telling, by focusing on HQs, you end up focusing on the global north so much of the time, and that's useful. It turns it from a problem of post or neocolonial exploitation and into something that's more accusatory. But I think yeah, there's a problem of how you then subsequently replace those things in the context where they come to matter. Yeah, that's a really useful point, and I appreciate you raising it.
Thank you for your response. And it's so interesting to hear how you navigated this and thinking of your just like not to make this into like a coffee table book, that you're working
Yeah.
on a different kind of project. So, and just
it's my biggest fear.
yeah. And then how you work with the visualization aspect. So thank you for that, Eric.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Further questions that people have right now? I had one. So in the spirit of not becoming a coffee table book, right? Were you to continue to unfold this? And this question actually comes from AJ Ternator, who is so upset that she couldn't be here today, but is such a fan of your work. She was wondering if you were to teach a semester-long class around the topic of extraction writ large, and perhaps she's asked you this in another context, but what data sources and tools? I mean, you've shown us the stack, but specifically, what might you like to bring forward? And I think this is a question of very broad interest.
Yeah, I think this is a question that this is something that I have a hard time with. In the sense, so I'm going to start with my first neuron fire, and then I'll get back to the actual question. So we bought this. We bought a bunch of data recently. The way it works. We had a bunch of money. We had some money left over after the proceedings were done, and we were trying to figure out what to do with it. And there's a data vendor called Mining Intelligence that sources, they're basically an enormous collection of automated scrapers for various industry websites. That they're just scraping information and reselling it. But they do it, they sell it back primarily to speculators and developers. Because it's a really interesting data set in the sense that for every mine you don't just have it's not just a location. You have year-over-year productivity. You have temperature measurements. You have sort of a great deal of information about the yield and the conditions of the mines. And so it's useful from a development perspective. I was so angst-ridden about the fact that we gave this company thousands of dollars. I think it was I had this minor existential crisis about the fact that we were actually just kind of we were paying the mining industry to do a project that was critical of the mining industry. I think that, so which, to get back to the question of the studio, I think, or the class, I think one of the things that it insists on, one of the things that I think is totally absent from the way that most people teach GIS, myself included, on a year-over-year basis, is we focus on locations, we focus on qualities of locations, characteristics of locations, things that happen in locations. It's very coordinate centric. It's very like, this is here. And we can do various things with that. I mean, we can say, how much of this thing is here? How is the presence of this thing related to this other thing? I mean, there's obviously all these spatial questions you can ask, but the thing that's limiting about that, right, is that in a lot of cases, it's not just that this is here, it's that this is actually a thing that's happening because this other thing happened over here. And I think the way that this kind of analysis insists on a certain type of relationality is a really challenging thing from a cartographic and a cartographic perspective, and even a kind of spatial analytical perspective. That's because it's not so much within the conventional GIS teaching toolkit to deal with. Because then, I mean, when you start talking about relationships, when you start talking about relationships, you're not just talking about topography anymore. You're not just talking about location. You're talking about networks. You're talking about graph theory. You're talking about a very different kind of space. Because when you start opening up the door to the fact that the stuff that's immediately around this is not the most salient thing that these are not the most salient things that produce this. It's in fact this thing way over here. You're kind of blowing up the basic assumption of the map, which is this is not like a new critique of cartography, but the kind of implicit yeah, the implicit, like super limited Cartesianism that tends to be employed by a lot of cartographic work is something that I'd love to figure out how to push back on. And I think doing a class on this, exactly this, would be a great venue in which to do it. And actually to plug others who are doing it well. I mean, I think like, I do think Bobby Petrusco, who usually teaches at the GSD, but is on a research leave right now, has done some really interesting work around mapping relationality and mapping, mapping relationally, mapping flows and movement and trajectories and all these kinds of things. I think also, I'm a little bit of, I'm sorry, I'm just blabbering endlessly, but I'm a little bit obsessed by the difference between the way that geographers think about space and the way that designers think about space, because they're two totally different things in a lot of ways. And designers actually tend to be much better at thinking about taking as a precondition the notion of movement and change, and geographers tend to be very like Doreen Massey, slice through time, like it tends to be a little more strictly representational. And I think the type of work that I tend to be most interested in is like who's using the best of the design disciplines, leaving out the worst of the design disciplines, and challenging the highly conventionalized world of geography adjacent cartography. There's I don't know. It's a great question. I would love to teach a semester-long class on this.
I and others would love to take that class. Well, no, and that really speaks to the other thing I wanted to ask you about were the moments of disjunction, right? You mentioned that in the course of your presentation, right? That the tools are sort of, but I feel like you've just spoken to that, right? In talking about the ways that the tools carve up the data in particular ways and suggest it as static, right? In a way that doesn't, right. Everything that you just said, right? I'm certainly not going to say that better, especially because we have 1.5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that other questions are able to come forward.
Yeah, hi, it's Patricia Salas here. I'm a MLK visiting scholar at MIT this year.
Great, yeah.
And I just wanted to say, I'm a First Nations Indigenous person that resides in quote unquote Canada. Yep. But I am connected to Wabanaki territory, which goes into quote unquote the United States. And so, you know, for a lot of our occupied territories, mining and extraction, you know, as depicted in the work that you've done so far, has had immense, you know, presence, let's say, in terms of the devastation and the oppression that our people have been enduring and continue to endure. And I think, you know, it's really critically important that, you know, for work that you're doing in particular, there could be a lot of, I guess, implication and application to an Indigenous context and an Indigenous frame. And I just hope that, you know, in going forward, while your hesitance to depict the scarring of our Mother Earth, you know, vividly, it's really important that be, to me, to be grounded in the understanding of our Indigenous traditional territories. And so, you know, just to, I guess, give you something to possibly consider how that kind of a mapping could be really important, and possibly strategic to how Indigenous communities and nations, oftentimes because of lack of resources and access and a number of other systemic, you know, racial injustice issues, that we do not have the best access to the best technology. And so I guess I'm just encouraging you to keep forging, you know, those collaborative relationships so that your work can truly benefit all of our planet. So Wiliwan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I fully take the, yeah, I take the point. I think it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of things we've, we yeah, I think we have a way of doing things that tends to amount to we're collaborative around events. I think and I think with the when we were working directly with Misson on the counter conference itself, we had a lot of First Nations voices in the room, and I think the problem has been like, okay, now we're no longer we're kind of a little more siloed in the way that we're working, and I think we haven't been as diligent as we could be about keeping up conversations with folks representing First Nations perspectives. I think that's a really important prod and in a crucial direction. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, thank you all so much. And I hope that you will all join me in a huge round of applause saying thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate your time and your perspective.
Thank you. No, thanks so much for having me. This is great. Thanks all for engaging.